In the opening chapters of the book of Revelation, there are recorded 7 letters written to seven different churches. One of those churches was a church at Smyrna. And I'd like to begin by reading that letter this evening. It's short. And verses 9 to 11, it says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Behold, or do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you'll have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Most of my life growing up, I can remember hearing this passage, verse 10 in particular, often read to describe that, well, as a Christian, you've got to be faithful. Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life, in the King James Version. And that usually was all that was ever said about that text. Well, yes, Christians are supposed to be faithful throughout the duration of their lives, but that's not what this text is about. This text is about Christians facing death for their faith. Being faithful to the point of death, even if their faith required their life. Not many years after this letter was written to the church at Smyrna, they appointed a new elder. His name was Polycarp. Funny sounding name to us. But an important saint to that church. An important saint for us today as we think about the faithful of days gone by. Polycarp had been mentored by the Apostle John. You might think of John and Polycarp the way you think of Paul and Timothy. There was a close relationship there. Of course, John was the last of the apostles to leave this world. You can imagine the church trying to move forward into the future without the apostles any longer with them. Polycarp represented a connection to those men. A connection to the past. An important connection, to be sure. But there he was in Smyrna, teaching and preaching the gospel. There was another man who had come along a little while later who was born in Smyrna, who grew up listening to Polycarp teach and preach the gospel. His name is Irenaeus. Irenaeus is, you can read all about Irenaeus, and he's left quite a legacy for us. But Irenaeus remembered Polycarp. And what I want you to notice here, Polycarp talked, or Irenaeus talked about Polycarp the same way you and I talk about those who were faithful, who left an impression upon us in our lives. He says, I could tell you the place where the blessed Polycarp sat to preach the Word of God. It is yet present to my mind with what gravity he everywhere came in and went out. What was the sanctity of his deportment, the majesty of his countenance, and what were his holy exhortations to the people? I seem to hear him now relate how he conversed with John and many others who had seen Jesus Christ, the words he had heard from their mouths. I get chills reading that. Irenaeus, thinking back to Polycarp, he says, I can see the place. Can you see the place? Can you remember the sound Can you remember the time where the teacher, where the preacher left an impression indelibly upon your heart? That's what Irenaeus is getting at here. He says, I remember that man. The gravity, he everywhere came in and went out. Now there are some gospel preachers over the years who've been described in quite reverential ways. That's how Irenaeus is remembering him. He can remember the majesty of his countenance. I've heard that Franklin Puckett was remembered as if he was a Supreme Court justice. Some of you might remember him. He was gone long before I was around, so I don't go back that far. But I preached in a pulpit for 11 years where he once stood. And that never was lost on me. I preach in a pulpit today where some men of great stature stood before me, and that's never been lost on me. He says, Irenaeus says, I remember the way he spoke the words of Jesus Christ. I remember the way he spoke about John. Irenaeus remembered his mentor. I love listening to Brother Amador talk about his mentor, Bill Reeves. Brother Amador's not here tonight. Some of you probably roll your eyes when you start hearing him talk about Bill Reeves. I love to hear him talk about him. I knew his sons. One of Bill Reeves' sons helped me put together the first sermon I ever preached from a pulpit. Well, why is Polycarp revered in such a way like this? Yes, his connection to John, but there came a time in that man's life where his faith was put to the ultimate test. As this text back here in Revelation 2 said, those Christians in Smyrna were going to be suffered with persecution. And they came for Polycarp. Now, this man had such influence among the civil authorities, that he was arrested and brought before the magistrate, and the magistrate didn't want to bother him. Magistrate had no interest in doing wrong to some old man. And so he decided, well, we'll find a way here to appease the mob and to save Polycarp. Polycarp, just curse Christ, and you can go. Now that was reasonable. That was reasonable in the mind of that magistrate. Polycarp was remembered as having said, 86 years I have served him, speaking of Christ, and he's done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and Savior? You threaten me with a fire that burns for a season, and after a little while is quenched. But you are ignorant of the fire that is of everlasting punishment, that is prepared for the wicked. That's a true story. That's courage and faith and conviction all wrapped up in this statement of Polycarp. So you know what they did to him, don't you? They tied him to a stake and they burned him. And someone, as an act of mercy, took a spear and thrust it into his heart, ending his life. Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. That was the legacy of faith that man had known and carried on in the church at Smyrna and exemplified to the very end. Now, this didn't happen all at once. This didn't come about all at once. He says 86 years. 86 years. Polycarp had devoted his life to Christ. And all of that 86 years of devotion coalesced into a single moment. It resulted in him laying down his life to receive a crown of life. It ought to impress you. It does me. You're talking about a legacy of faithfulness. It begs to question where you and I stand in our faith. Do you think tomorrow doesn't matter? You think tomorrow is just Monday? And what difference is just another Monday, right? You think it doesn't matter the kinds of choices you and I make? You think it doesn't make any difference if we compromise our integrity? Polycarp represents an example of, well, it does matter. 86 years of Mondays. 86 years, day by day, moment by moment, a decision by decision. It all led up to a single moment in time where all of the faithfulness, all of the development, all of the sacrifice, it all came together. Tomorrow matters. Yesterday mattered, and the day before that. Each day of our lives matters. What we're doing to prepare ourselves matters. I want to talk to you tonight about the fruits of faithfulness. The fruits of faithfulness had been sown in Polycarp's life long before that test had come. And had those fruits of faithfulness not been sown, perhaps I wouldn't be standing here talking to you about him tonight. Fruits of faithfulness. Fruits of faithfulness. First of all, faithfulness produces loyalty to Christ and to saints. That's what you see in his example. In many ways, his loyalty to Christ is demonstrated and shown by his loyalty to saints. What impact would it have had? What impact would it have had in that environment of persecution had Polycarp cursed Christ and went home? What kind of influence would that have had on the church at Smyrna? If their elder would have done that, it would have been influential, to be sure. But that's not what he did. Oh, he was loyal to Christ, and it had an influence for all of the right reasons, in all of the right ways. Loyalty to Christ and to saints is demonstrated throughout the Scriptures. What you see Polycarp doing throughout his life and to the very end is how the faithful of God's people have consistently sacrificed over time. I mean, you go to the Bible, you find somebody like Stephen in Acts the 6th and 7th chapters. That represents a turning point in the early days of the church. Here was a man who was committed to Christ, who served the saints in Jerusalem. He was put to the test, and his life was taken from him by an angry mob. Luke remembers his dying words as he dies as Jesus did. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. But it didn't just end with Stephen. You can read about James a little while later. James is quite a personality in the New Testament. Jesus, when he was with Jesus, he was known as one of the sons of thunder, James and John. Paul speaks of him as one of the pillars. One of the pillars is how those men were known in the church of Jerusalem. James, his life is taken. He's killed. And there's 3 different historical accounts outside of the Scriptures about the martyr of James. There was it was an opportune time. It was an opportune time for the Jewish leaders to take out James because, the Roman governor, man who I believe his name was Albinus, serving in Pilate's old position, was out of town. And when he got there and found out what had happened, he was not happy that one of the leaders of the Christians had been killed by the Jewish leadership while he was gone. Well, what did they do with James? Well, they only took him to the temple and threw him off. Think, what a horrible end. The only thing was, when he hit the ground, he didn't die. Some men came along with their clubs. One account says these men were fullers. Laundry. Dealt in laundry. How do you wash laundry in the ancient world? A fuller's club. Like a billy club that a police officer killed. They beat him to death. That's what they did to James. And then there's Peter, one of the other pillars. Crucified. Crucified. Despite all of the efforts, that governmental authorities used to stop Christians in the ancient world, their efforts were fruitless. We're the legacy of it. Polycarp, Stephen, James, Peter, they all fit what is said here in Hebrews chapter 11, making the point how the faithful of days gone by have always suffered and have always sacrificially given themselves. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in the dens of caves of the earth. And I'm quite sure not one of them would want to be remembered tonight as being part of a hall of faith. They didn't have that kind of pride. They served God. Put their trust, their lives, their souls into His hands and His hands alone. I don't think they would have needed to be taught about grace. They knew just exactly how they would be saved. Yes, the fruits of faithfulness is loyalty to Christ and to saints. If you and I can't be loyal to one another, how do we ever expect to take some kind of stand out here in the world? We need one another for strength and support. It was a hostile world that these people lived in. We think things have changed. Things are different for us at this point in time in this place, but there are saints tonight whose lives, whose realities are far too similar to the likes of those that we're reading about here tonight. We ought not to forget that. Another fruit of faithfulness has to do with courageous conviction. I saw a quote somewhere that said, faith is arguing what you believe, arguing about what you believe. Conviction is being willing to die for it. Most of us are willing to argue about just about anything. We'll even argue about what we believe and why we think we're right and why we think somebody else is wrong. We're good at that. But being willing to die for what we believe? Brother Easton touched on that in his Bible class this morning. Now, I don't know. I don't know how we would react, respond in the face of the kinds of things that Polycarp was faced with. Face the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Conviction is the follow-up to faith. Do you have faith? Conviction is how it's demonstrated, it's shown and revealed to everyone around us. Over here in Acts chapter 4 and verses 19 and 20, we get some indication about what courageous conviction would sound like. When Peter and John were taken before the rulers, the very ones who saw to it that Jesus was crucified, when they're presented before them, they said, whether it's right in the sight of God to listen to you or rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we've seen and heard. That's conviction. That could have been the end of them right there, then and there. Yes, the Sanhedrin was compelled to release Peter and John at this point. But after this response, maybe they changed their mind. We sure are hard on Peter, aren't we? This is the kind of thing we'd think they'd say. Now, there's a man who had conviction. A man who wasn't afraid. You realize the power of what you and I claim we believe? You believe Jesus was raised from the dead? If you believe that, then what are you afraid of? Now, we're afraid of all sorts of things. We all just want to fit in and quietly go about our lives. This is not an arrogance. This is the product. This is the product of believing. I mean, they had seen the resurrected Lord. They weren't afraid of anybody. There was nothing that anybody was going to do to silence them short of taking their life. And if that's what was going to happen, then they were content with it. And eventually it did, as far as Peter is concerned. That's the kind of conviction that we need as Christians. We need to stop being afraid about what other people are going to think about us. Worried about what the other mothers at the PTA are going to think. They hear about how we raise our kids. Worried about what other people at work are. Worried what's going to happen. What might happen if I'm not willing to go along with what everybody else seems to be going along with these days? Conviction's what we need. Finally, faithfulness, it produces the hope of being with Jesus. The hope of being with Jesus. When Polycarp was put to the test, his mind went to Jesus. His mind went to his Lord. 86 years. And he's done me no wrong. Jesus was everything to him. He had him, and that's what mattered most. He knew that, well, this life isn't all there is. that there's something better that awaits those who put their trust in Jesus. And so, yes, it was a horrific thing that he was facing. But he knew that it was temporary. It'd come to an end, and it did. But in losing everything from one perspective, he was gaining even more. Reminded of what Jesus says in John 14. Let not your hearts be troubled. There is much over which our hearts can be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to what I have told you, that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come again, and I'll take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. I remember when Paul, imprisoned, wrote a letter to the church of Philippi, and he knew that his days were numbered. He had work to do, and he was going to do his best. But he said, hey, to go and be with the Lord is far better. Is far better. But in the meantime, I'm going to help you. You and I, we're offered this hope. The hope that Jesus gave the apostles, it's offered to us. It's offered to anybody. Everybody. If they'd believe. If they'd seek to pursue the kind of faithfulness that we see demonstrated in the examples that we have talked about tonight. We need to learn. We need to learn from these examples. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. That's what Jesus said. I am grateful to God for the time in which I live. Yes, faithfulness is expected throughout the duration of life, but that's not the point here. The point is seeking to develop a faith that is sacrificial, a faith that is willing to pay the price because a price has been paid for us. So I hope that we would be inspired by men like Polycarp, Peter, Stephen, James, and all of the nameless ones of days gone by. As we face our lives, as we seek to sow the seeds, to bear the fruit of faithfulness to the Lord. I appreciate your attention tonight. If there's someone who'd like to obey the gospel, who needs to obey the gospel, you have an opportunity to do that tonight. If you're willing to devote your life to faithfulness, if you're willing to make that kind of commitment in your discipleship, then yes, you can be baptized, immersed into water for the remission of your sins. Begin a new life of learning, worshiping, growing, and sharing the good news of the gospel with everyone around you. If that's the kind of life you want, the Lord is willing to give it to you. If you make your request known, as together we stand and sing.